Good afternoon, everybody. A great pleasure to welcome you to another one of ResPublica's webinars. Local government reorganisation isn't necessarily the political topic to set blood racing and cause you all levels of passions to rise to that of Brexit, but it is the stuff of controversy, and one need only recall the famous poll tax riot. So local government finance does have that sort of potential. Now, we at ResPublica have been working in the field of devolution and local government reorganisation for over a decade. We wrote the original Devo Mank report and have been consultants and written many reports at all levels of the British state, from working with CCN to DCN to core cities and with key cities. So we've worked with every type of place. And we've just today published a report, Size Doesn't Matter, where we argue that actually, if we're thinking of local government reorganisation and devolution, contra the government's plans as they were in summer of devolving to a constituency that had to be of a certain size, there's no good evidence for the premium that attaches to scale, precisely because the places in this country vary by place, and a very small place can still be a place that is determined by what's surrounding it. What we believe in at ResPublica is that nobody would invent the two-tier system if they had a blank sheet of paper in front of them. And what we favour theoretically is unitaries everywhere, small unitaries, large unitaries whose footprint measures or captures their actual current economic activity. And as one of the colleagues on the panel, Tim and I were saying before this conversation, Britain's governance is still governed by borders that are over 1,000 years old, in some cases even older than that. And our economics and our economic models have changed, and yet we are still constrained by boundaries that are the function of our deep, deep history. And what we think, in the light of not just least COVID, but all the externalities that shape our world, is that we need something that can control all of those externalities. Now, we've long argued, as has indeed Tony Travers, as have others, that actually the most successful part of the state is the local state. And what I think we urgently need in this most unequal of modern countries, which is rent economically and socially, where the penalties of place are something like the Greek notion of destiny. They are determinative. And arguably, place is the biggest inequality in our country. Where you're born still dictates to an enormous extent what happens to you. So how are we to address this? We've long argued that we need a body to control or influence or shape all of the factors that determine place, that have a role in place. And we've long believed that that needs to be a unified mind or a unified governance structure that shapes those forces that impact upon place, that can govern things like economic growth. By far the biggest impact on public health, for instance, is economic. If you have a job, if your locality offers you economic stability. And again, the local state is arguably the best position to facilitate that. And so it goes on. And so for us, it was somewhat depressing to see once more local government reorganisation, like everything else to do with local governance, from the rates and other matters, including fiscal devolution, to run into the mud, such that we end up with this messy compromise that probably satisfies nobody. So what we wanted to do in this webinar isn't to reinvent kind of old disputes that don't exist between different levels of governance, but rather to ask, what does devolution need such that it can make the real difference that this country needs in terms of quality of life, in terms of equality of life, in terms of leveling up, in terms of regional imbalances, in terms of fostering the private sector, in terms of creating a world that is much more economically and socially stable, where well-being is right at the top of the agenda, and where environmental factors, not least pollution in the air, are mitigated as much as possible. So we've got an absolutely stellar panel, and I'm enormously grateful to all of our participants for joining us. We have the Mayor of the West of England, Tim Bowles. We have the leader of the District Council Network, John Fuller. We have the chair of the County Council Network, David Williams. We have Professor Tony Travers from the LSE, who's long been a visionary advocate of localism. And we have Bruce Katz from America, who's joining us at 4 p.m. UK time to give some international parallels to what we want to do. So let me begin by asking Tony, if you would, to open up with a sort of an account of where you think the devolution debate is, why it's got trapped again, and what we need to do to reinvent it in a much more visionary, transformative guise. Tony, over to you, and thank you.
Okay, Philip, well, thank you. Good to see you and your colleagues here this afternoon, and it's good to be taking part in a ResPublica event, because ResPublica and Philip have continued to be instrumental in thinking about these issues and driving the debate forward. So thank you. I mean, as ever with things in Britain, I think progress on devolution, or the modern form of devolution, we put behind ourselves, you know, the sort of Kilbrandon 1970s discussions about it and moved on to a very modern version, is equally, it's become a classic of British government progress, i.e. sort of random evolution, but not radical. So it's not that we've stopped, it's just that it's a bit stop go. And sometimes there are ministers who really believe in it, like George Osborne, and sometimes there are ministers who carry on with it, but don't look to me like they're just not as interested. And it is worth just briefly touching on how we've ended up here, which was really, I think, after the major devolution in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and as particularly Manchester authorities, there've been the London reforms, began to sort of work together, created the logic of a need for combined authorities, which at the end of the Labour government were allowed. And then David Cameron, who I think, like Tony Blair, rather liked the idea of directly elected mayors. I think they were both slightly presidential prime ministers who liked the slightly presidential, with due respect to those on the call in the event, Tim, who are mayors, like the idea of these presidential figures, a bit more like American politics. And you know, you can see why they both rather liked it. So we ended up with, in some parts of the country, combined authorities with then directly elected mayors, which I'm not sure all the combined authorities really wanted, but they were prepared to accept them in exchange for greater resourcing, mostly in terms of grants. And so in the best traditions of British government, we've ended up with an inexplicable patchwork. My test for this is, you know, nice foreign visitors turn up and you try to describe the local government system in England to them, and you can see their eyes glazing over after the first 3 or 4 minutes, which doesn't mean it's wrong. It is what it is. That's what we're like. But anyway, and I think it's fair to say that George Osborne in particular and his advisors strongly believed in building up city regions. There were other policies for towns and smaller, you know, not city regional authorities with combined authorities, but the powers and the resourcing for certainly combined authorities and directly elected mayors have only really come through the districts where there are combined authorities and where the mayor tends to be a sort of first among equals figure. The mayors have not been given, in my view, sufficient direct access to their own resources in a way they might be in another system or a more developed version of this system. Now, as you imply, Philip, we were expecting a devolution white paper, which had been promised in the Conservatives' manifesto last December. Only last December, it seems a long time ago, November, December, a long time ago now. And it does appear that even before there was a risk of a delay, it looks like a delay to it, that it had become slightly more oriented towards a local government reorganisation than to allow more devolution, creating this endless problem we have in England, and to some degrees in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland in a different form, of permanent local government reorganisations, which I have to say at a personal level, and you've rather got there before me, Philip, I do see to some degree as displacement activity, as a way of doing something rather than tackling whatever the real problem is. Now, of course, if there were unitary authorities throughout the country, it would be easier to have then a new sort of combined authority or two-tier system. But that begs the question of whether all areas actually want it. And if you believe in devolution, in my view, you can have variegation and some areas deciding to have rather different solutions to a one-size-fits-all ones. So as we move forward with the existing pattern of combined authorities, possibly more mayors, possibly different arrangements evolving in the rest of the country which doesn't have combined authorities, then I do think there's a broader question of what form of fiscal devolution, tax devolution, and indeed should powers be devolved to a greater degree in order that there is a logic to greater devolution of tax raising powers. We don't want local authorities, and particularly combined authorities, heavily dependent only on government grants. And, you know, I don't want to talk about what you might call very, very of its time events, but the current spat going on between central government and various mayors has at its roots the fact that government controls all the money, and subnational government, if I can link it all together, that rather ugly frame, has very little access to money. And in other cities and in other countries, there would be greater access to local resources at the local level, not meaning everything has to be denominated through a negotiation with the very core of government. So to complete within 5 minutes or 6.5 minutes I've taken of the 5 minutes you gave me, I do believe personally, I'm not going to get into a debate about Brexit or indeed the politics of COVID-19, but coming together as they have, and given the stresses and strains they put on our government system at all levels, I do think you could argue that as we move away from Brexit and COVID-19, it provides an argument for a constitutional moment in the United Kingdom, in which would allow us to think about what would be a better, longer-term form of devolution within England, and how to balance England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom as a political entity, and that might have all sorts of other beneficial effects anyway. So I think I'd leave you with the thought that we can do all that, we can have more devolution, and also we can have devolution with equalisation of UK tax resources the while. Wales proves that, Northern Ireland proves that. So I'm still optimistic, and I hope that we can have some kind of constitutional reset.
Thank you very much, Tony. Absolutely fascinating. I broadly agree with you that we are in a constitutional moment. I mean, and I'll bring up this question again after the initial statements. But what strikes me about Britain and about Philip McCann's work, Professor Philip McCann, who would have been with us but has to testify in front of a government select committee, is just how unequal the UK is, just how high the penalty is, which is a class penalty and a place penalty, and how little we've managed to address that, arguably. Arguably, since the end of the Industrial Revolution, the penalty for being born in the wrong place is still pretty lethal. Now, what kind of, if I may force is that what matters is that we have a form of state that is bespoke, that can deal with the specific problems in an area, because we know that areas historically have responded differently to the economic and social changes that have happened. So one distinction, for instance, between Liverpool and Manchester is Liverpool went from low-skill industrial revolution to low-skill service sector. Manchester tried to educate its workforce up to go from relatively low-skill manufacture to higher service sectors. And it actually matters over time. And so the argument for a bespoke interventionist state that can control as much as possible, I think, remains if we want to tackle the inbuilt disadvantage in our country. We want things to stay the same, we needn't do anything. So this is the ideal time now to turn to John Fuller, who's a visionary local government thinker, genuinely, and also is happily chair of the District Council Network. John, over to you. In the light of, I think Tony's absolutely right, that we have a constitutional moment, and in the light of, which you may or may not accept, in my view, the need to have an effective local form of intervention to change outcomes. What are your thoughts on what's needed versus what we have?
Okay, well, thank you, Philip. Good afternoon, everyone. In your opening remarks, Philip, you said, well, everybody must have been so disappointed that devolution has run into the ground. And I, for one, am not, because devolution had become framed in terms of local reorganization rather than the transfer of powers and cash and aspiration. And the fact that it had been so misdirected, that it has been kicked into the long grass, can only be a source of comfort and celebration. Frankly, during the COVID crisis, the final mile has stood up and been demonstrably the part of the state that has grown the most, done the most. And in fact, had it not been for councils of all types, social care, children's services, the homeless, collecting the bins, keeping the parks cut when everybody could only mix together when they were outside, we have given the government nationally breathing space to try and sort out PPE, track and trace, and all the other things that have gone so well. In your opening remarks, you said, would you create two-tier? And the answer is, well, you probably, if you were starting again, not as it is today, but I think the entire essence of your report, size doesn't matter, is that actually two-tier does work on a horses for courses basis. I think there is absolutely an argument for scale if you're running a fire service over quite a large territory, so you can afford some of the specialist equipment you may need to do to fight a fire, sort out pollution, stuff like that. But equally, I think you need to ensure that at the very low level, things like homelessness, street cleansing, whatever, can only really effectively be done on a local basis. One has to ask the question, and you attempt to ask this, what is the state for? What is a local authority for? And it isn't just about transactions. It's not just about managerialism. How dismal would life be if that's what it was? You might as well just end up with national government. You wouldn't need local government at all. Local government exists to capture the essence of people's hopes, dreams, and aspirations. And and it's not just in localities, it's understanding the texture of cathedral cities, the difference between seaside towns, new towns, market towns, the countryside. And the history is, and the evidence demonstrates it, as your report brings out, that some of these secondary settlements, which are more dynamic, are more compact, do have a greater sense of local identity, actually perform better economically. There's a greater dynamism, and COVID has shown a greater desirability. I'm not quite sure in the situation they find themselves in New York, where there's urban flight, but certainly the future is not necessarily about the city, and we need to recognize that. I think, though, that devolution, and it may well be a more substantial two-tier system may be coming, because I don't really object to the division of labour, where a mayor of quite a large territory, East Anglia, for example, could go to China and raise £1 billion for me to spend locally in my district. I think that's quite a good division of labour, and one that I would welcome. And it plays to Tony's point about finance. I think we have to maintain sufficient granularity, because if you are to have the freedom to bulk up to deliver certain things, blind to administrative boundaries, on one hand, you still have to have that the locality area to reflect people's hopes, dreams, and aspirations. Not least of all, because in all of this, the essence of local government is democracy. And it's about accountability, and it's about standing firm and being accountable for what you would argue is a good thing, the postcode lottery, and ensuring that there is an equality of representation, so everyone's vote counts the same, is at the bedrock of our democracy. And I'm delighted that your report shines a strong light on that. So yes, let's bulk up pensions, fire, certain regional things, but we desperately need to keep local homelessness, housing, parks, leisure, environmental health, and if you like, the very local knowledge that is currently putting to bear on track and trace is really important. Up until now, size has been really calibrated in terms of population, but there's a geographic element too. Where I live in Norfolk, taking one side of the county to another, if you were to superimpose one end on London, it would go through Brighton and 30 miles out to sea towards France. That is the scale of some of our larger territories. And I think, that the thought of someone, if you say to someone in London, and many people on this call, a single authority from Charing Cross all the way out halfway across the English Channel is a preposterous notion. You mentioned finally, now we could be at a constitutional moment, and I think we are, but not for the reasons you think. There's a chapter in your report, Philip and Mike, that says, opposition to the mayoral model. I didn't expect that opposition to come from number 10, but I do think that Andy Burnham has grossly misplayed his hand in a very disappointing way. And I suppose you would say, well, he would say that, wouldn't I? But even his colleagues in his own party have left him high and dry as the tide has gone out to see him not wearing any trunks, because ultimately, the point about finance is important. There are sources of finance which we can bring to bear, but with finance comes risk. And ultimately, I think what the people in number 10 will now be thinking about is that devolution should not be a heads they win, tails we lose moment. We should not be able to give all the resources out, but have none, but still maintain all of the liabilities.
John, can I press you if I may? So I agree with you about locality and granularity. And that's exactly what I think place captures, because some places might have an industrial legacy, like County Durham with its economic geography of coal mines that are then determinative in how people live, that just simply isn't present in areas that didn't have that history. So I agree with that. And that's what we're arguing for, is governance that wraps around place to deliver, as you say, that aspiration, that hopes, those dreams. But can you tell me what else you need to deliver on their aspirations, on their hopes, on their dreams? Like, are there any powers that you think currently still reside in Whitehall that are not subject hitherto to devolution that should be? So if you want to make good rightly on your residents' local needs, hyper-local needs, what more needs to be added to the Devo mix to make people's dreams capable of being realised?
Okay, so well, let's nail some of those. I mean, it plays to that constitutional moment, because we're having this discussion, and I'm looking at the participant list largely amongst ourselves. We are the experts in local government. We are interested in the final mile. This is what we do. But talking to ourselves isn't going to solve this problem. We need to ensure that the DFE lets go of skills funding. We need to make sure that, DEFRA and the Environment Agency sort of finally let us put the flood defences where we can at least grow the economy. We need other arms of the state to let go. And I think the long shadow of the events of this week will be that if there was any scintilla or hope that there was a willingness from other spending departments to let their colleagues in local government shoulder some of the load. That has evaporated this week, sadly, like rain on hot tarmac. And we're going to have, it's going to leave a shadow over the devolution white paper, which I think is wholly regrettable. And I just don't know quite where it's going to go. We have to keep redoubling the efforts. We are the most cost effective. We are the most innovative part of the government. We do the final mile. Without local government, there could only be national government. But our battle is going to be with the mandarins in Whitehall to say, look, trust us really. And I think
thank you very much, John. I'll come to you shortly. Tim, again, thank you very much for joining us. Wonderful to have a mayor of combined authority with us. You're at the level beyond the two-tier where you try to unify and produce this reach that enables you to influence the factors that influence the places that are your constituent membership. So it'd be really interesting to hear from you as to what you think is needed from a re-endowed, reinvigorated devolution that would enable you, like John, to deliver for the residents of your area.
Philip, thank you very much, and really pleased to be part of this discussion. Where shall we start? So I'm just going to pick up a couple of John's points, if I may, because I don't fundamentally disagree with a lot of what he was saying. But I think the crux of it for me, therefore, is what the respective roles of different elements of government are. Whether it's central government, whether it's regional, whether it's local, and with respect to my other colleagues here from that, I'm not going to get into the debate around unitaries, districts, and different tiers. I grew up in a county I'm very proud to have represented, and that bore out Philip's earlier point, but that boundary was set literally hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but we're still trying to operate both government models, but more importantly, from my perspective, economic models. And the combined authorities were set up with the view to be the ability to both convene but work cross boundaries on those things that are relevant to the economy. So I always talk to people about how we live and work. I'm sat in my office today. My office is about 7 miles from where I live, but I technically live in a different unitary authority area to the one I'm sat in today. It has no bearing, that boundary line, on how I live and work. And that's how economies work. They don't look at that. So I absolutely, having been a local councillor and still very proud to be involved as a parish councillor, agree with John about those things that should be delivered at local levels, because that's the right way for those to be delivered. I would therefore argue that it is correct that those things that work across the region, whether it's skills, economic development, infrastructure, those are the things that combined authorities should be focused on, because they cross those borders, they cross those boundaries, and the people that I serve do not identify which side of a line. And let's face it, in some areas of my region, you can live one side of the road and you have a service that's delivered by one council, and you can live literally opposite and it's delivered by the other. People don't pick where they live and work by their council boundary, but I totally agree with John about those local service things should be done at that level, should never be done at a much grander, larger space. But those things that do, those things that affect people's skills, how we bring together digitization, how we look at decarbonising, how we look at how jobs develop, how our areas seek the right investment. You've touched already, I think, on how even within the Northwest, you have two very, very close city regions, but their economies aren't very different. Therefore, that's why they came together as those two combined authorities. I smile working with my other metro mayors, because Warrington's the bit, if you like, along the M62 that misses out. And I think one day they look one way and one way the other, but almost Warrington, bless them with that lovely buffer. That's the comments of my two respective colleagues who are the regional mayors. But that's why this works. So I would suggest that we should be looking at what's the correct, because my job is the economy, what is the functional economic area? And people can show that, and we did the work on that, and we did that. I was a unitary councillor who was absolutely supportive of this long before there was any thought of people standing for the role, because we should be looking at it as that functional economic area. Sometimes people play politics about whether they then join or not. That's for others to look at. And that's a consideration in government about if you're going to form authorities to be specifically, if you like, involved and leading in areas, how you get that geography in the right space. So we need, I think, to work at devolution on where it is the right thing for the region. So I would argue that myself and my colleagues are better qualified to understand what our region needs to support its businesses, to provide the skills that we need, to do the infrastructure that connects people to opportunity, far more so than Whitehall. Though at the moment we have been the most centralised UK operation there's been. It is not the right way to have been doing these things. Whitehall are not the people who are qualified to do that. That's why, and I think Tony and others touched on it, that's why we need to genuinely get the departments in government to genuinely devolve those points. We as Metro mayors talk about two things. We talk about the tools, but also the powers and the tools. The tools are invariably the money. So we do need to see proper devolved funding away from Whitehall in those areas. But also we then need those powers and abilities to really deliver. So we're quite often asked to go back to government to check our homework. Now, Philip already touched on the fact that the way in which you address the inequalities in the Northeast would be very different perhaps to the way that we would address them here. Principles the same, but surely we as the people on the ground are the right people to be making those decisions because they differ. Centralisation hasn't adjusted that. It hasn't delivered in that space. So for me, there is definitely a role in this space, but we need to be clear about what everybody's respective roles are. So to be honest, John, please be absolutely assured, appreciate you're not in the west of England, but there would be no way in the world I would want to see any of those powers that you quite rightly deliver through your councils as being the things that we should be doing even on a regional basis.
I mean, the interesting
devolving powers.
If I may, Tim, what's interesting about the current kind of patchwork offer is the least contested elements seem to be the combined authorities. So precisely because combined authorities allow individual areas to influence what influences their area. And I think they've been the most successful element. I'd be interested if Tony would agree of this new settlement, as have the mayors, because if you think of how controversial it was, and now it's much more widely accepted. So that sense of localities coming together to influence what they can't influence by themselves is, I think, kind of very powerful. Can I just ask you, in terms of looking forward, as a mayor of a combined authority, what are the powers you would want going forward that you don't currently have to make that difference to your area?
So 2 points, and so I'm going to slightly go back one, if I may. Firstly, we need both those tools to match the powers that we've got. So if we're able to do that, we can show everybody in the region how we can genuinely deliver. We are delivering. We have brought hundreds of millions of pounds of additional investment into the region, but I still need those additional tools from government to unlock what I can do. For me, then, it's a case of what then really feeds into those things that can again be better done in the region, decided in the region, that feed to economic growth. But I do need to make sure I have got that tool and the funding to do it. So again, if you look, we have lots of different other organizations we have done a lot of work around infrastructure in terms of bringing together, for instance, Highways England, Homes England, Network Rail, into ways in which we've been able to convene people to operate more effectively. If you think of those three big organizations, they all actually own an awful lot of asset that effectively will have a bearing on how I can unlock the economic opportunity here. They own the asset, but they also own an awful lot of that funds. So for me, it's how I'm able to convene that. We're doing that. We're doing it really effectively here, but there's that point. But for me, it's always going to be about what are those other things that can help me develop my economy. Skills for me has always been one of my passions. We do need to look at how we're able to bring those things together. I was very proud to have been a governor for 12 years of a very, very successful state school. But we still need, and I look back on my time as one of those governors and think, actually, I did an awful lot to try to keep cohorts of sixth formers staying in my sixth form, as opposed to necessarily think about what was the right skill set for those young people where I live to be able to learn the skills that they need to serve the sectors and the industry and the opportunity that exists here. So,
thank you very much, Tim. Great. Okay, let's move to the county area. We did a report a while ago for key cities where we pointed out that the smaller towns, often located in counties, were the ones that were growing quicker, precisely because of their connections with other smaller towns. And it's the exclusion, relatively speaking, of these areas from the devolution process that I think has been so retrograde. And so, David, as chair, as both the county leader and chair of the county's organisations, your thoughts on where devolution is versus where it should be?
Well, thank you for inviting me to this discussion, Philip, and I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to getting stuck into the detail of the report that you've published today. You'll recall it was, under 3 years ago, something like that, you did a report for CCN and made a very forceful case for counties in the devolution debate as it was at that time. I think that on the back of that report in late 2017, that was when government first announced its intentions to produce a devolution framework. And so I think that report was quite significant in terms of bringing that about. Inevitably since then, things have been overshadowed by Brexit and by parliamentary weakness. And so when we were looking forward to last year's election, the Conservative manifesto, the commitment to the devolution white paper, I must confess, I thought we were on the cusp of seeing the long heralded policy interventions coming to fruition, and that our areas would begin to get some of the devolution powers that we've been striving for so long, particularly in relation to the need to deliver economic growth. You highlighted the issue of towns and the non-metropolitan areas, and that's a key concern of mine, Philip, when thinking about devolution and the way forward. And actually, more often than not, it's in the context of areas that are left behind. So when I look across CCN, there are the old mining communities, there are a number of coastal communities that do need an awful lot of attention. We've talked about some key areas for devolution. We've talked about health and skills. Tim's talked about them, and you and John have spoken about them as well. And Tony's raised the issue of fiscal devolution as well. I think all of those things are absolutely critical in terms of supporting local areas, be that in terms of population health. There's a really interesting development in Surrey, where Surrey have exercised a degree of leadership over the local ICS, the new health body in Surrey, which we haven't seen yet, even in Manchester, in terms of devolution. And I think that's a fantastic test bed for how population health and engagement with health and the NHS in particular can come into this devolution question. Skills we've talked about, and I think we're all agreed that skills has got a key role to play in terms of localities. And then fiscal devolution, you know, when I look across county authorities and see the infrastructure requirements to support the level of growth that we are potentially looking at over the next few years, inevitably we are left with a begging bowl, deal-based approach to try and secure funding for infrastructure. I always remember Michelle Dix, who from TfL, when she was leading on Crossrail 2, coming to see me in Hertfordshire to see what I could contribute towards Crossrail 2. And inevitably, there was the contrast with what Sadiq Khan could offer up in terms of mayoral SIL, strategic infrastructure tariff, opportunities that were just simply not available to me to contribute. But look, when I look at the priorities immediately going forward in terms of devolution, I inevitably tend to focus on, I'm going to focus on three things, Philip, and share them with you. First, I think there is a real disconnect between genuine place leadership and local planning in England today. So key spatial planning considerations, including growing sustainably, employment, connectivity, and the keen focus to deal with regenerating those left behind places in England, and many of them are not just in metropolitan areas, they're also in county areas as well. There is a legacy of a proliferation of local planning authorities, and that planning is focused on housing numbers rather than spatial planning considerations, strategic planning considerations. Now, coincidentally, CCN has published a report by Catriona Riddell Associates today, which offers a solution to try and fill the strategic planning void. We outline a way forward that proposes strategic planning advisory bodies, bringing together council leaders, businesses, health, environmental leaders to set out ambitious visions for their areas, joining up industrial strategies, employment and housing with infrastructure delivery, whilst balancing health and climate concerns. The second thing I'm going to put on the table, Philip, is that we should encourage more growth boards to be set up, bringing together the best expertise from local authorities and business in local areas. So from my experience chairing Hertfordshire's Growth Board, which has been formed by the County Council, the 10 district and borough councils, and the Hertfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership, these boards can play a game-changing role in not just bringing all the key stakeholders and businesses together, but creating a shared vision to put developing a shared vision that we can follow through and put those plans into action. Now, given the deal-orientated environment that we're working in, they can have the capacity to take forward proposals, negotiate deals with central government and the private sector, and importantly, provide an appropriate degree of accountability and assurance. And then the third thing I would say is I don't think government should abandon the principles of setting out a clear framework for devolution, including local government reform. There are too many players regionally and locally. So what are the responsibilities, the geographies, the institutions that will provide the capacity and the accountability to take powers from Westminster to move our places forward and build the communities that will enable our residents to thrive? in the wake of coronavirus, almost every part of our local economies are going to have to be reimagined, from the role of the high street to different commuting patterns to jobs and the industries of tomorrow. If we have to learn anything from the past few months, it's that a purely bottom-up devolution and reform agenda will simply lead to a protracted debate and achieve very little. Government needs to take the lead and set out the rules of the devolution game.
Thank you, David. Some fascinating points there. I was struck by all three remarks, and I really look forward to reading your report on planning. I think the point about growth boards is fascinating. And Bruce Katz, who's joining us from America in about 15 minutes, has just published a big report on this. And what's interesting, if you look at America, the private sector in rundown areas has turned around American cities. It's turned them around, and Pittsburgh being the most obvious example, but it's happened across the country. And that's much rarer in the UK. In the UK, we don't really have private sector business leaders who are visionary in the sense of engendering debate. I can only think of Jürgen, who used to head up Siemens, who did it so well for his area, but he's German, so he's coming from a context where that's it. And understandably, most business leaders just don't want to put their heads above the parapet. We do have the Northern Powerhouse Partnership that I think does very well. I know that you're a great advocate of growth boards, as is Tim in the west of England, who's also led in it. I think this is the missing third plank of our turnaround situation, which is genuinely getting local business leaders to formulate their own policies, commission their own research, and lead in partnership, but lead rather than being led. And I think this is the other part of devolution that we mentioned. I also personally agree about, in Tony's remarks about constitutional settlement, we do need to ask what local government is for. And as in the great traditions of ResPublica, our reports probably annoy purists in all camps, which I apologize for. But what we are trying to do, and I'm very grateful to John and DCN for giving us the platform to do an independent report, it speaks very well of them, is we're trying to come up with what you talked about, which is what are the objective basis for the reorganizations that we need. And I think the only thing we can truly argue is place. What is a place? And ask what that definition is, because again, I agree with John, where he talks about the granularity that we cannot surrender. Again, I agree with John about the final mile. But then we have the question about what influences that place and what best influences that place, and how we can make real the dreams of people in that place. Because I'm born and raised in Liverpool. I've studied the North for a long time. And your place of birth in the North is destiny. If you combine the postcode where you're born with your mother's level of education, that is what, as I've said before, the Greeks call fate. And if devolution can't tackle that, then it's not worthy of the name. And we've got to stop deploying devolution as if it's a remedy for leveling up. So let me sort of just mention to the audience, I've had some wonderful questions from people in the audience. So thank you so much. I'm just going to ask the panel a few more questions. I'll try and put them into as few as possible. Then we're going to have Bruce Katz, all being well, joining us in 10 minutes. And then I'll turn to some of the audience questions at the end and ask them. So hopefully that leaves you all somewhat satisfied. So here's my point. So Philip McCann's work is, I think, very good at showing how we're in a long trend of disadvantage. We're among the most, if not the most, unequal developed Western economy of comparable size. Many parts of our country have levels of disadvantage and poverty below that of the worst American states, and with allied to that of East Germany. Now, if you think what the East Germans thought when the West Germans came in and said, we're going to unify with you and we're going to have a 10, 20-year program to upgrade the life chances of people in East Germany. And they thought, and it was akin, it's different, it was akin to President Johnson's war on poverty. Now, what's interesting to me is that we have nothing on offer from the centre that is any way equal to any of the great state endeavours to settle some of these long-running inequalities, these long-running penalties. If I was being a little bit depressed, I would say that what we have are very small incremental gestures that by themselves, and just the nature of these things is it's done by themselves, don't make enough of a difference. So that we will continue largely, and it's very difficult in public policy once you're on a path to get off it, we will continue largely down this path of place-based penalties where working class kids essentially are shut out from all the goods of life. And we will continue to have a society that's run by and for upper middle class people. Now, if that is not necessary, and we know it isn't because we just have to look to other countries, what are the policy mixtures that we can come up with? One of the things that always kind of strikes me is that thinking this through radically, Britain is a mixture of a developed country and a developing country, but we run all of our macroeconomics for London and the Southeast, and we don't do anything about the rest of the country that is in effect an emerging economy. Is there any way of really thinking much more radically around tax, around investment, around our regulatory framework? After all, we've devolved tax to Northern Ireland, corporate tax, so it can be on the same par as the Republic. We've devolved income tax, though the SNP have never used it, to Scotland. What we at ResPublica have done is we've done a few manifestos. I believe, I'm right in this, I was the first person to call for an MIT of the North, for instance, because the North has suffered a skills deficit since the end of the Industrial Revolution. We also have called for completely different tax and fiscal arrangements where, for instance, you don't pay capital gains tax at anything like the same level in the North, where you have corporate tax, complete write-offs for moving to the North. I remember President Mitterrand's great attempt to force public institutions out to the regional French cities. What have we done? Had a really big fight over about 100 people from Channel 4. I mean, nothing we do is equal to anything really that other people have done. And we all sit and fight with each other and also don't fight and try and make the best of it. Is devolution incapable of thinking radically around something that could genuinely transform ideas and outcomes for people? One of the things we've published and written about is I'm in favor of localizing the NHS. I'm in favor of creating a completely localized health environment that has been made even more manifest by COVID. And I argued for this before COVID, precisely because the central NHS doesn't have a good record on dealing with chronic conditions, and chronic conditions are what essentially robs people of healthy lives. And the centre is very good at acute diseases, but it's very poor at managing the chronic. And the only people that can manage the chronic are the locality, because people's conditions is shaped by their geography and their locality. So I'm not particularly directing this at anyone, but perhaps I'll go to Tony first. So I'll counter myself. Tony, is this a hopeless ask in the UK for something on a grander scale that could make a difference to people? such that we stop being such a class-ridden, place-determinative society? Or should I just move?
Well, oh no, never give up. I mean, if anybody spent as much time of their life as I have trying to even make modest changes to the local government finance system with almost zero effect, should never give up. I think that the truth is that some of there's a whole, I mean, without going too far into the analysis part, which we all spend a lot of time doing, I mean, the economic changes that have led to the country you describe have occurred over at least 50, some might say 100 years. So the Jarrow March marched south. So, you know, these things have occurred over a very long period. You know, Ed Glazer would argue they have something to do with the weather. People move towards the better weather in a country. And so the idea that it's going to be solved by, you know, by one government, which is always, it's not unique to this issue, but somehow we're going to take office, we are government, and we're going to sort this out. The Blair government was going to level up, said it was going to do that, set targets for the RDAs, that didn't work out. The present government said it's going to do something. It's all been pushed to one side for the time being. So you've got the fact that the economic drivers that lead to the particular layout of the United Kingdom have been many, many decades in the making. The second is that, and I've been indulging in a bit of conversation in the chat function, you know, England within the United Kingdom is so centralized that even decentralization is a centralized process. That's a hideous paradox. It's like the court of Louis XIV. You know, you've got to go to London in order to argue the case for a bit of devolved power for, you know, be it the west of England or Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, wherever it is. So the whole, even decentralization is a centralized process. And I suspect that the reason we shouldn't give up is that, you know, I do think that the system, and you know, I don't want to politicize this or bring it to the current affairs too much, but I just think that the handling of COVID-19 has exposed how difficult it is, with the best will in the world, and I'm sure the government's tried its best, to handle what is essentially a very localized series of outbreaks of a disease, of a virus, from one set of desks in one place. I just think it's made that point at scale. And we're now struggling with trying to devolve some of this process, but it's still pretty centralized. So I think that trust would be restored in government to some degree if more decisions were made nearer to where people live. They'd meet the mayor or the leader, they'd meet the councillors more often than they ever could MPs. And I think there would be more trust if more health, more skills, more education were the responsibility subnationally. So, you know, I think we just have to, as in all democracies, it's an evolving democracy in Britain, and England within Britain. We just have to go on pressing till the logic of the case becomes inescapable.
Colleagues on the panel, who would like to comment on this? John, over to you next.
Yeah, I mean, Philip, you called for a big idea. Well, how about this one? You know, a big idea is something you can sell in the dog and duck. And whilst I don't deny that growth boards could become part of it, we are never going to bring the population with us when having to explain the distinction between a growth board, a LEP, county boundaries set down in 1066, or even borough boundaries which go back 800 years, as happens close to me. You know, I think we just need to have sense of the big idea is that everyone has the opportunity to serve, that actually the government is going to allow what works to thrive regardless of historic administrative boundaries. We can't end up in a system where only the rich and retired motorist has a monopoly, because they're the only people who can get to the county or town hall miles and miles away. That people have, the rich retired motorist has a monopoly over who makes all the big decisions. You know, more bureaucracy, more difficult to navigate on an ever larger scale is not the lesson that has worked with COVID in this country, where the most local responses have been the most effective, or in other parts of the world. I mean, you mentioned this. I think the big idea is that by getting ever larger units gives us better results has to be challenged. If that's the way we're going, then let's just get rid of local and end up with national.
John, that's yesterday's battle. Nobody's arguing for that in this event, and we expressly argued against that. And I said that at the outset, because some places aren't big for that simple reason.
But a big idea allowing what works to flourish without being so hidebound over sort of rigid views of what success is. Population densities, geographies, even topography. I mean, for whatever reason, Cumbria has been drawn into this ambit, and yet there's a mountain range separates the top and the bottom. We need to say what works rather than sort of be dogmatic.
And we have a what works centre, but like I feared at the outset, it just comes up with the incremental and the small. And I'm just conscious of the politics of change. So our settlement in the West that we've created has created levels of inequality that are no longer politically sustainable. That is true in Europe, it's true in this country, and it's true in America. That in part is why they elected Donald Trump. So what's interesting to me is what are the big ideas that aren't regressive, aren't horrible, aren't reactionary in the pejorative sense of that word, that could give us an out. Sorry to ask these big questions, but in an odd way, precisely because you're all from the local, and the local, in my view, is more effective than the state, than the central state. This is the place to ask them. These are, this is the right level. David, did you want to come in?
Well, I'm really going back to what you were suggesting, Philip, about levelling up and some of the levers. Hertfordshire is the home of the garden cities and the home of post-war new towns, and there are a fascinating. They provide some insights insights into how our country has evolved over the last 50 years or so. So if I could take the case of Stevenage, for example, Stevenage, the first of the post-war new towns, 1946, just recently celebrated its 70th anniversary. All the infrastructure is crumbling at the same time. That infrastructure includes some incredible facilities such as cycleways and underpasses, the thing that's designed brilliantly. Residential neighborhoods, an industrial zone. And in the 50s and 60s, a whole load of people came out of London, very aspirational. They found jobs in light engineering, printing, those sorts of sectors, and then defense industries as they existed at that time. Look at Stevenage today, and you have some fantastic level 7 graduate type employers like GSK, Airbus, the cell and gene therapy Catapult, offering jobs which many of the residents of Stevenage are not qualified to take. And so there is a huge regeneration challenge, which is about infrastructure spending. There is a big question in my mind in terms of spatial planning. So Stevenage is a very tightly bound local authority, local planning authority, population of about 80,000. In my mind, it could be significantly larger based on taking a really appropriate spatial planning view of where growth and where employment and different types of employment, affordable housing, should be delivered. And then, of course, at the same time, you need to be pulling every lever you possibly can in terms of educational attainment, skills training, apprenticeships, degree apprenticeships, etc., in order to enable more people from the local community to find jobs locally.
David, if I could stop you there, precisely because we're at just the great point. Thank you for platforming Bruce Katz, who now joins us from America. And David was there, I think, very eloquently and movingly describing the opportunities that business have and the skills gap between those, you know, very high level, high demand businesses and their localities in which they're operating. Now, Bruce is one of, you know, the most prominent international thinkers on localism, and has just very interestingly produced a report yesterday on the role that businesses can have in the United States of turning around whole cities and whole economies, and the support system that businesses need to do that. Now, I was involved in the early years of Big Society. I worked with David Cameron. I championed this, and it failed largely because there wasn't enough state involvement. That's the way I would change it. There wasn't enough local state involvement, but largely because we don't have a culture in this country of businesses taking a proactive role at a scale that makes enough of a difference. And we don't have the ways to plug businesses that want to make a difference into the state to augment and double up that. That isn't true in America, because not only do they have that tradition, they also have philanthropy at scale as well. That makes an enormous difference. If ever you visit America and their civic spaces, they genuinely have a culture of giving, and we genuinely, in comparison, do not. So what I think is the third element that's missing from our conversations is how we restore this business function. And I know David's talked about it and Tim has talked about it. And I think it's vital. It's the other leg of the stool, I think. But anyway, enough. Bruce, over to you to explain both your latest report and the lessons from it, and welcome.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry for joining late. It's just a bit chaotic here with less than 2 weeks to go to this election. But I just wanted to focus on one aspect of the crisis we're facing and how we're thinking about it in the US. This is a Main Street-led recession, high street-led recession. I think what we have learned so much is about the fragility of small businesses in the United States with less than 20 employees that focus on local serving business, and particularly the fragility of Black and Latino-owned businesses in the US, less revenue, less likely to have relationships with traditional financial institutions. And so what we are focused on very much is this marrying of federal support, national support, around particular kinds of financial products, a broader set of financial products, but local ecosystems, public, private, civic, university, hospital, major employers that can essentially match up the demand coming from major employers for purchasing of goods and services, mentoring and nurturing of small businesses, and with a much broader continuum of capital that exists today. I think what we have found out through this entire process is that many of our fragile small businesses can't take on the kind of traditional debt that they're provided by financial institutions. What we need is a whole different kind of revenue-based investing, shared profit models, with different kinds of investors basically populating different kinds of funds. So as we're moving forward here, there is enormous energy in the US, all of Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, St. Louis, Philadelphia, with basically having local employers make serious commitments to supplier diversity, buy local, to have local investors and financial institutions basically stand up and populate new kinds of funds to serve a broad continuum of Main Street businesses, deep tech, commercialized R&D, small businesses and entrepreneurs, and then a whole ecosystem around support, mentoring, nurturing. Can the national government, or the report we put out yesterday, Big Ideas for Small Business, the national government can help catalyze all this. They can basically through the Small Business Administration we have here, provide a broader continuum of capital. But frankly, when all that hits the ground, it only works if you've got this network locally that can harness it, pull it together, and then leverage it up for full impact. So I think what we're finding through this entire process is, even though we're talking about the necessity, the imperative of national leadership across multiple dimensions, whether it's small business, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's human capital and workforce development, at the end of the day, those work best when you've got these tight networks locally that are have their own skin in the game, their own capital, probably more discretionary, more nimble, more entrepreneurial than national capital, but they can knit together these different pieces. And so, you know, we'll see what happens in 2 weeks, knock on wood, fight for the soul of the nation and all that. I truly hope Joe Biden's the next president. I truly hope the Senate turns Democrat. But it's not like we're going to hand over to the national government the future of small business. We need a national response to galvanize the energies, the expertise, this local rootedness that we have to basically build back better. And we've learned a lot, but one thing that we definitely take from this entire crisis is the more organized across sectors, across disciplines, across different kinds of capital sources you are locally, the more likely you'll come out of this faster. And that's, you know, for the devolution debate in the UK, it is about both devolve down within the public sector, but basically activate across, harness energies across multiple sectors.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bruce. So as I was saying earlier, I was trying to do this back in 2008, 2010. And I think the fundamental thing that was lacking is there was no incentive for business to do this. So the situation David describes is one where essentially all the big leading businesses already have their employers. They're not connected to place in any meaningful way. I mean, on our Q&A, there's lots of very good questions and points that we used to have the Cadburys, we used to have the Quakers who cared about their locality. We don't anymore. We don't have patriotic local capital. We don't even have patriotic national capital. And we may well have significant local businesses run by local business people, but they're often squeezed out by the big transnationals and the big national players, Amazon being the most obvious. So what it would need to succeed, at least in Britain, is some form of structured incentive that localities might be able to award to businesses that could make a genuine difference to them, such that the costs of educating people who you hire locally, the cost of bridging the skills gap that David talked about, is in some way reflected in the incentives that a local authority might be able to give you, either in terms of lowering your local tax burden or giving you some form of R&D expenditure. So is that something that would be on offer in America, or are they just doing it out of the goodness of their hearts?
I think this is a different kind of stakeholder capitalism at the local level than is talked about at the global level or at the national level. I do think when I talk to business leaders, I'm doing a lot of work, particularly in places like St. Louis and Cincinnati. There is almost a desperation for talent from services firms. What they find, and this may be similar in the UK, when we talk about workforce development, and there's been long-standing focus on manufacturing, on construction, on the healthcare sector, technicians in hospitals. There's been less focus on what insurance companies, banks, health management firms need in terms of data analysts and software engineers and information technology experts. They are desperate for talent. And because the pace of technological change is so fast that they can't do it by themselves. So what we're beginning to see, Rhode Island, actually, because it's a small state and it's a city state, is best example of this. It's called Real Jobs RI. It's an integrated way for companies to come to a variety of skills providers. Some are nonprofit, some are for-profit, some are 2-year colleges, some are 4 years, and basically say, this is exactly the kind of skill set we need. We will help you co-design the courses, co-design the curriculum, and within a 6-month boot camp kind of operation, you can basically help us remain competitive and keep our edge. So this is not philanthropy. The companies are basically saying to us, in mid-sized cities, we have a need over the next 2 or 3 years, even coming out of COVID, for hundreds of workers to either be retrained or to come into the company. And we're looking for an industry match with the higher ed system and the skills system to basically deliver that. And so on the investment side, investment in small business funds, I think that's where the tax code potentially could catalyze it, promote it, move it faster. But on the skills side, I think what we need is to match up the ability to train workers for really a next generation of technology as quickly as possible.
It's great. It's fascinating. My colleague Mark Moran wrote a piece, a report, skills for jobs that don't exist yet, and he was talking about the type of institutions that offer those intermediate skills, where they have very short courses that are tailored to local industry that upskill people very, very quickly. And this is actually something that our localities, because FE and FE funding is devolved, is something that could be replicated here. So just before we conclude and turn to the audience, Bruce, if you were to make one ask of business in the light of your most recent work, if you were, and if you were to develop one measure that could be introduced as a law or a procedure, either locally or federally, what would that be?
I mean, this will sound a little strange, but right now in the United States, I would say we are in a fact-free zone with regard to small business. We don't know how many Black-owned businesses we had pre-COVID. We don't know how many have collapsed. So when you start looking at all the national goal setting that is going on, let's triple the number of Black-owned businesses. We don't even know the starting point right now. So, if, without that kind of those kind of metrics, you can't really measure anything, and we're not sure we're going to make any progress. So I would say we need a level set. It'll probably for the national government be a price of $500 million to just get a level set on where are we with these small businesses, which every politician in our country will say are the backbone of our society. But what we have found is we have an antiquated system with capital that's not fit to purpose, with local purchasing that leaves the cities and metropolitan areas in which it's located. So I think let's start with that level set, and then we can basically build back a 21st century system of small business finance, support, capital, customers, and services. So I've got an easy ask for everyone right at the beginning. Let's just find out what the hell is going on, and then let's start building from there.
Move from unknown unknowns to known unknowns.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not a bad first move. Okay, look, we've had fascinating discussion. What I'd like to do is turn to the audience. Now, what I want to do, just given the time we have, is can I ask audience members just to ask their question and leave it? I'm going to try and fit in 5 or 6 questions, and then I'll let the panelists choose which of those questions they want to answer. And I think that's the way to get the most in. So can I go to Colin Noble, first of all? Colin, can you come in and ask your question, please? Mike, can you facilitate? Here he is, here's Colin. And then after Colin, I'm going to go to Mark Goldstone, Bridget Smith, and Rebecca Derber. Colin, hello.
Hello, thank you, Philip. One of the questions, and I think it is framed in some of what you've been discussing today in devolution, is the notion of obviously COVID is having a significant effect on jobs and it's having a significant effect on our high streets. Would something like, through devolution, a more localized sales tax rather than business rates, which clearly doesn't work as more and more businesses move online, would that help raise money and then that money be used locally to replace the current complex system of grants we have that support both county and district and boroughs as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. Absolutely apposite question. Can I ask Rebecca Derber, please, if she might join us to ask her question?
I have promoted Rebecca to panelist and she will be joining in a couple of seconds. There you are.
Hello, Rebecca. Hold it, you need to unmute.
Sorry about that, perils of Zoom. Thank you for that. I was wondering what the panelists thought the future of health and social care devolution was and whether we can expect that areas are going to see more Greater Manchester style deals.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Bridget Smith, please.
Oh, thank you. Oh, sorry. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I'm just going to go back and find my question that was here.
I've got it. Do you want me to read it out for you?
No, it's okay. I'll wing it. So going back to COVID and really picking up very much on John Fuller's very well made points earlier on, you know, COVID has actually really shone a very bright light on the advantages of particularly district councils, but also county councils, and of our ability to work in partnership with each other and to actually really deliver in the best interests of a very varied population. You know, I'm in South Cambridgeshire. Things are different here to how they are in Yorkshire, to how they are in London, and so on. But we are flexible, we're adaptable, and we've been able to get things moving very fast indeed. So my question is it worth the risk dismantling the current model, because we will have more pandemics, you know, and you know there will be more emergencies as well. You know, what model can you guarantee will deliver as effectively and as fast as we have been able to do?
Thank you, Bridget. Very good question. I'm going to Mark Goldstone now, and then the last person will be James Strachan. Mark, are you there? You just have to unmute Mark. Mark may have left. Is Mark with us, Mike? Okay.
He appears to be there, but I do not know if Mark can actually...
Oh, don't worry. Okay. James Strachan then. Strachan.
I believe James has left the...
Okay. Well, I'll ask Mark's question. So Mark said, I would welcome the panel's views on the siloed nature of government and whether devolution needs to cut across these in order to deliver a more holistic approach to economic growth, e.g. adult skills has been devolved for some, yet secondary education remains outside of regional control. So that's a suite of questions. I'm going to go to each panelist, just a short response or summary, if you will, and you don't need to answer them all, but choose which one. Tim, might I ask you to have a first go?
With pleasure. And can I jump straight into Mark's and go, yes, you're absolutely right. Government is siloed. I get it on a daily basis. I keep making the argument to government because ultimately Treasury holds the key. But you've got silos of ministries and civil servants who are very much like this. I would make a case in pretty well everything that I'm involved in, how it cross-cuts so many different departments. But you tend to have the conversation with one department only, who then try to make the case to Treasury. So if we talk about health, well, everybody's spoken earlier about education, where we live, the quality of our homes, our opportunity, all of these things affect health. We talk about transport, again, where homes are built, digital connectivity, and on and on and on, Mark. So absolutely right, there are too many silos in government. The objective of us as combined authorities and metro mayors is for us regionally to be able to bring those together, but we're still getting held back at these silo walls. So absolutely agree with you.
Thank you, and I reiterate and agree with your point wholeheartedly. So thank you very much. David.
Okay, let me pick up Bridget's question about the sort of two-tier area response to COVID. I mean, I have to say, Bridget, the way I view this is there are 151 upper-tier authorities in England. Some may say that's too many, but you know that's the reality. There's 151. Only 25 of those are county councils operating in two-tier areas. Now, I'm sure many people on this call would point to all sorts of fantastic stuff that's been done in terms of volunteers, in terms of shielding, in terms of environmental health officers on the ground, enforcing gatherings and particular licensed premises and all the rest of it. So there's been a huge effort across the whole of local government. I don't think that's uniquely linked to two-tier areas or an example of two-tier areas. I think whether the structure is two-tier or unitary, local government has responded fantastically to the crisis.
Thank you very much. John?
Well, I mean, the question, you've got to draw the line somewhere. And whatever you do, you know, you need to draw the line. And what your report says is you can draw lines, but those lines need to be flexible. They need to respect what are you trying to achieve. And there's a much bigger line to be drawn on raising funds from international capital markets than there is on the small one. I think my premise and what I've learned from your report, and this isn't a district versus county, because not least because this report has been co-commissioned with our colleagues in the Unitary Councils network, our valued friends there. And I think the lesson we learned there is that population density is almost as important, the geography, and the ability, the flexibility and the granularity, you know, to pal up with colleagues on matters of common concern. Crossing boundaries laid down 1,000 years ago. We haven't really discussed, as perhaps we should have done, concepts of the Thames Gateway, the Morecambe Bay issues. And I think we just need not to be blinded by what's gone on in the past. And let's look forward to 2066, not back to 1066. And we do that at a level where Bruce Katz and his colleagues in local business can feel they can play a part. They want to be part of smaller bureaucracies and be more dynamic and use their commercial skills to affect change at the place level. None of these guys have the time or expertise necessarily, or even the contacts, because they're so busy running their businesses, to navigate huge bureaucracies. And I think that's sort of really where we are. We need to keep our feet on the ground whilst being able to look up to the skies.
Thank you very much, John. Tony, choose whatever question you'd like, or free form.
Yes. Well, I mean, the sales tax issue, particularly with Bruce on the call here, because he's an expert on American subnational government, if I can call it that. I mean, the difficulty we've got is that business rates are not a great tax from first principles. So we do need some sort of property tax. Most countries have them. They bear a lot of weight at the moment. And the difficulty is that COVID-19 and the impact on many, certainly retail and town and city centre businesses is such that, you know, if they're reintroduced, given the current levels of relief, unless that relief is kept there for the next year or so, there'll be a terrible impact on town and city centre businesses. So it does raise the longer term. The government has a consultation running on the longer term, with the longer term review of non-domestic property taxes. I think the difficulty with sales taxes is that, you know, in theory, they are located in places, so it's imaginable, and American cities often have sales taxes. Quite how they work alongside or on top of a value-added tax has always slightly worried me, but I suppose you could have both. And the truth is, it would potentially push up, I think it would, economics being what it is, if you had no or less or no property tax, it would push up the values of property more or less to the level of rents and rates. So, and then the money would come from those buying stuff in stores. Others have talked about an online tax to represent changes in the economy. So I'm not going to answer the question, save to say that business rates are not a great tax. They're under a lot of pressure because of COVID and town and city centres, and indeed the growth of online trade. We've got to have some local taxation other than council tax, and it would be good to have whatever successor there is to be to a business rate, if we do have one that was still local rather than a national tax to replace it. So that's a slightly rambling answer to say business rates are in trouble and sales tax is an option. It's certainly worth looking at.
Thank you very much. Bruce, I recognise these are UK questions.
Well, sales tax isn't. There's lots of sales taxes in America.
No, I know, but sales tax in the UK context. But just your insights on any of them would be more than welcome.
I mean, on the tax devolution question, we've got 50 states, so we have at least 50 ways of basically allowing cities and municipalities to raise sales tax, income tax, tourism tax, property tax. I mean, it's an absolute, varied mess in the US. And some of those taxes are incredibly vulnerable to the shutdown, lockdown. But it does, in normal periods, give local government the ability to have a seat at the table around many, many issues. I would say this question, going to what Tim was saying, the central government, like ours, is a vertical, hierarchical, compartmentalized silos and stovepipes machine. It's like built for the 20th century. What cities do is act horizontally. They act across disciplines, across silos, and across sectors. It's as much cultural in terms of what places think about and how to problem solve in this new way as it is about any law or regulation or mandate. So I would say my major comment is there's a culture of devolution where central governments, when you ask them to collaborate across departments, it's an unnatural act. I was chief of staff at the housing department. It's an unnatural act. They say they'll do it, they don't do it. They stay inside their fortress. At the local level, you get the culture of collaboration to compete, collaboration to problem solve. You can just move across all these silos. And the federal government or national government don't even know when you're braiding and blending resources to actually solve the problems. So I would say that creating a culture of bottom-up local agency and collective action is really the most important thing.
Thank you. Look, can I just thank all panelists? It's very good of you to give us your time. I think it's been a genuinely engaging and visionary discussion. We at ResPublica will take these ideas forward. We'll hopefully take them forward with some of the councils, the many authorities that are online now. I'd like to thank everybody who's online. I'm very sorry if I didn't get to your question. We'll try and do better next time when we have another event. So thanks to all. This has been recorded and will be online, and we will email all participants, not least with links to Bruce's latest report. So thank you all. I wish you well and stay safe. Bye-bye.